The silence inside the Sterling estate wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a museum after hours. Arthur sat in his motorized wheelchair, positioned perfectly in front of a floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the Pacific Ocean to anyone passing by on the beach below. The house looked like a dream, a structure of glass, steel, and white marble worth $80 million. To Arthur, it was a high-tech tomb. He was 82 years old, and his body was a map of betrayals. His hands, which had once signed the blueprints for the world's most advanced software systems, now shook so violently he couldn't hold a spoon. His heart, once driven by the fire of competition, now relied on a pacemaker and a cocktail of 22 different pills a day behind him. He heard the soft click-clack of sensible shoes on the marble floor. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. She was the fourth top-tier medical professional his children had hired in 6 months. "It's time for the afternoon vitals, Mr. Sterling," Beverly said. Her voice was professional, efficient, and entirely devoid of warmth. She spoke to him the way a mechanic speaks to a car that is about to be scrapped. Arthur didn't move. He kept his eyes on a lone seagull fighting the wind. "I'm busy," he rasped. His voice sounded like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Staring at a window, sir," she sighed, the sound of her patience thinning. "We have a schedule. Your son called this morning. He wants a full report on your blood oxygen levels before the board meeting tomorrow." Arthur felt a familiar spark of bitterness. His son, Julian, didn't want to know if his father was happy or if he was in pain, or if he had remembered the name of the woman he had loved 40 years ago. Julian wanted a data point. If Arthur's oxygen was high, the stock prices stayed stable. If Arthur looked like he was fading, the vultures in the valley would start circling the company. "Tell my son the oxygen is fine. But the air in this house is stale," Arthur muttered. Beverly didn't respond to the joke. She didn't even acknowledge it. She simply wrapped the cold cuff of the blood pressure monitor around his thin arm. To her, Arthur wasn't a man who had built an empire from a garage. He was a client. He was a checklist of symptoms. Everyone who entered this house failed him in the same way. They looked at his bank account and saw a god, or they looked at his medical chart and saw a corpse. No one looked at Arthur and saw a person. Later that evening, the family dinner took place via a large telepresence screen in the dining room. His daughter, Claire, beamed in from London. Julian was on a laptop from a private jet. "You're looking stable, Dad," Claire said, squinting at the high-definition feed. She was wearing a necklace that cost more than a suburban home, a gift Arthur had sent her for a birthday he hadn't been invited to attend. "I feel like a piece of furniture, Claire," Arthur said. "Perhaps you should have the staff polish me tomorrow." Julian chuckled, but his eyes were on a second phone in his hand. Always the dramatist. "Listen, we're looking at a new facility in Switzerland. It's world-class. They have robotic assistants and 24-hour monitoring that links directly to our phones. Beverly says you've been difficult with the medication. This place would take the pressure off everyone." "The pressure off who?" Arthur asked quietly. "You or me." The silence on the video call was deafening. They didn't want to care for him. They wanted to manage him. They wanted to outsource his final days to a place where his difficult nature wouldn't interrupt their meetings or their vacations. They had all the money in the world to provide for him, yet they couldn't provide the one thing he actually needed, a reason to keep breathing. By the end of the week, Beverly quit. She claimed Arthur had thrown a glass of expensive scotch at the wall near her head. Arthur claimed he was simply testing the laws of gravity. In reality, he was just tired of being handled like a fragile, expensive vase. The house was empty again. The agency was contacted. The elite care recruiters were panicking. Arthur Sterling was unmanageable. He was a billionaire with a death wish, waiting for someone to finally see him. Even as he pushed everyone away, that was when the agency sent Maya. She didn't arrive in a limousine, and she didn't have a list of degrees from Ivy League nursing schools. She arrived in a beat-up compact car that rattled as it climbed the steep driveway of the Sterling estate. She carried a worn canvas bag and a small, Cheap terracotta pot with a sprout of green leaves peeking out of the dirt. When the heavy oak doors opened, Maya didn't look at the gold leaf ceilings or the original Picasso hanging in the foyer. She looked at the security guard, smiled a genuine tired smile, and said, "I think I'm in the right place. I'm here to see the man who lives here, not the billionaire, not the client, not the patient, the man." The first thing Arthur noticed about the new woman was that she didn't smell like bleach. Every other person the agency had sent over the last 3 years arrived smelling of industrial disinfectant and expensive perfume. They carried themselves with a stiff, artificial posture, as if they were afraid that touching the furniture might cost them a month's salary. Smelled faintly of cinnamon and rain. She didn't wait for him to acknowledge her. She didn't stand at the foot of his bed with a clipboard, waiting to read his vitals like he was a science project. Instead, she walked straight to the heavy motorized curtains and pulled them open, letting the harsh morning sun flood the room. "The light is better for the soul than the shadows, don't you think?" she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a certain groundedness to it. It wasn't the high-pitched, fakiri tone. The other nurses used the tone people usually reserve for toddlers or the dying. Arthur squinted against the glare, raising a trembling hand to shield his eyes. "Who gave you permission to touch those?" he barked. He tried to make his voice sound like the iron-fisted CEO he used to be, but it came out as a thin, pathetic wheeze. "I prefer the dark. It matches my mood. Get out and send in whoever is supposed to be handing me my poison for the morning." The woman didn't flinch. She turned around and looked at him. She wasn't particularly tall, and she wore simple scrubs that had clearly been washed many times. In her hands, she held a small, chipped clay pot with a tiny green sprout leaning toward the light. "My name is Maya," she said, ignoring his outburst entirely. "And this is a peppermint plant. It's struggling a bit, just like this room is. I thought we could keep each other company." Arthur stared at her, stunned by her casualness. "I don't care about your weeds, Maya, and I don't care about your name. You'll be gone by Friday. They all are. I'm a very difficult man to be around. Just ask my children, they pay people to stay away from me." Maya walked over to his bedside table. She pushed aside a stack of medical journals and a silver tray filled with expensive watches he no longer had the strength to wear. She placed the little plant right in the center. "Friday is a long way off," she said. "A lot can happen in 3 days. For instance, you could tell me why a man with a view of the entire ocean chooses to stare at a gray carpet all day." For the first time in a year, Arthur didn't have a biting comeback. He was used to people arguing with him or apologizing to him. He wasn't used to someone asking him a question that required him to look inward. He watched her as she moved around the room. She wasn't cleaning in the way the maids did. She was tidying his space with a sense of respect. She picked up a framed photograph that had fallen over a picture of Arthur standing in front of his first small warehouse 40 years ago. She wiped the dust off the glass with her sleeve and set it back down where he could see it. "You looked happy there," she remarked. "Your eyes were bright. You looked like a man who knew how to build things." "I built everything you see," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave. "And look where it got me. I'm a prisoner in a house made of windows." "You aren't a prisoner of the house, Mr. Sterling," Maya said softly, finally approaching his bedside to check his pulse. Her touch was warm. She didn't use the cold metal sensors. She just held his wrist, her thumb resting gently on his skin. "You're a prisoner of the idea that you aren't useful anymore. People have spent so much time taking care of your body that they forgot you still have a head and a heart." Arthur felt a strange lump in his throat. He tried to swallow it down. "I pay for care, not for philosophy. Just give me my pills." "I'll give you the pills," Maya agreed. "But only if you tell me one thing that isn't on this medical chart. Tell me what you wanted to be when you were 10 years old. Before the software, before the billions, before the glass house." Arthur wanted to tell her to leave. He wanted to call the agency and demand a professional. But there was something about the way she stood there, patient, steady, and looking at him like he was a human being instead of a paycheck, that stopped him. "A gardener," he whispered, so low he almost didn't hear himself. "I wanted to grow things." My mother had a tiny plot of land behind our apartment. We had nothing, but we had the best tomatoes in the city. Maya smiled. It wasn't a pitying smile. It was a spark of recognition. Well, she said, handing him his water, it seems we have something to talk about besides your blood pressure. Over the next few days, the routine of the house began to shift. The other staff members watched in confusion. Usually, the morning session involved Arthur yelling and the caregiver emerging from the room looking stressed. With Maya, there was only quiet conversation. She didn't follow the sterile rules. One afternoon, she brought in a bowl of warm water and a soft towel. Instead of the quick, clinical sponge baths he hated, she washed his hands slowly, carefully cleaning the grime from his fingernails and massaging the joints that ached with arthritis. The doctors say movement is bad for your heart rate, she said as she worked. Tomorrow, we're going to the balcony. I haven't been on the balcony in 6 months, Arthur protested. The wind is too much. I'll catch a cold. My son says I should stay in the climate-controlled zone. Maya looked him in the eye. Your son isn't the one living in this body. You are. Do you want to die in a climate-controlled zone, or do you want to feel the salt on your face one more time? Arthur looked at his shaking hands. He looked at the little peppermint plant, which was already looking greener thanks to Maya's care. For the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of something that wasn't anger. It was curiosity. Balcony, Arthur agreed. But if I die, I'm firing you posthumously. Maya laughed, a bright, honest sound that echoed through the hollow hallways of the mansion. Deal, she said. When they finally made it outside, the transition was jarring. The air was sharp and smelled of kelp and tide. Arthur winced at first, the sensory input feeling like too much for his frail system. But then Maya sat down on a stool next to his chair. She didn't talk. She didn't check her watch. She just sat with him, watching the waves crash against the rocks. Everyone failed you, Arthur, she said quietly, using his first name for the first time. They failed you because they thought your money made you a different species. They thought because you were powerful, you didn't need to be touched, or heard, or understood. They treated you like a monument instead of a man. Arthur looked out at the horizon. A tear, thin and slow, tracked its way through the deep wrinkles on his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He didn't have to be the titan of tech out here. He was just an old man with a caregiver who actually knew his name. Why are you doing this? Arthur asked. The agency pays you the same, whether you're nice to me or not. Maya looked at the ocean. Because I know what it's like to be invisible, she said. And because no amount of gold should be enough to bury a person alive. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, the billionaire and the woman from the beat-up car sat in silence. The fate that everyone else had accepted for Arthur's slow, lonely fade into the dark had just been intercepted. The weather turned at the end of October. And with the cold air came a heavy dampness that settled into Arthur's lungs. It started as a small, dry cough during dinner, something he tried to hide by taking a sip of expensive sparkling water. But by midnight, the sound was wet and rattling, echoing through the empty, marble-floored hallways. Maya was there before he even had the chance to press the call button. She didn't come in with the panicked energy of the previous nurses, who would have immediately called an ambulance and started shouting into their radios. Instead, she sat on the edge of his bed, rubbed his back in slow, rhythmic circles, and helped him sit upright so he could breathe. Deep breaths, Arthur, she whispered. Just focus on my voice. Don't look at the monitors. Look at me. For 3 days, the fever raged. Arthur moved in and out of consciousness, drifting through memories of his childhood and the stressful, loud boardrooms of his middle age. Every time he opened his eyes, he expected to see a team of cold, robotic doctors, or perhaps his children standing over him like they were inspecting a faulty piece of equipment. But every time he only saw Maya, she was always there, changing the cool cloths on his forehead, humming a song he didn't recognize, or telling him stories about the mountains in her home country. On the 4th morning, the storm arrived, not the weather, but his family. Arthur's son. Julian and his daughter Claire burst into the house. They didn't come to hold his hand. They came with a man in a sharp gray suit who carried a leather briefcase. They stood in the doorway of the bedroom, looking at their father with a mixture of pity and impatience. "It's time to be realistic." "Julian," Claire said, her voice loud enough to cut through Arthur's foggy mind. "Look at him. He can't even hold his head up. This house is too big, and this caregiver is clearly out of her depth. He needs a facility. A real one." Maya stood up from her chair by the window. She looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes, but her gaze was steady. "He is resting," she said softly. "The fever has just broken. He needs peace, not a relocation." Julian stepped forward, looking at Maya as if she were a piece of lint on his jacket. "We appreciate your effort, really, but we've already made the arrangements. There is a private hospice wing in the city. They have the best technology. They can keep him comfortable until ... Well, until the end. We've already signed the preliminary papers." Arthur, lying in the bed, felt a cold surge of terror. To them, he was already dead. They were simplifying their lives by moving him to a place where they wouldn't have to feel guilty about not visiting. They wanted to put him in a box before he was even in the ground. "Isn't going anywhere," Maya said. The room went silent. Julian laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Excuse me? You are an employee. We are his blood. We decide what happens when he can no longer decide for himself." "He can still decide," Maya insisted, stepping between the bed and the family. "He's just tired. But he told me he wanted to see the garden grow. He told me he wanted to hear the ocean. You want to take him to a basement in a city hospital because it's efficient? You aren't failing his body. You're failing his soul." "That's enough," Claire snapped. "You're fired. Pack your things. The transport team will be here in an hour to take our father." Maya didn't move. She turned her back on them and looked at Arthur. She saw his eyes were open. She saw the fear in them, the fear of a man who had conquered the world only to be kidnapped by his own children in his final hour. "Arthur," she whispered, leaning close so only he could hear, "if you want to stay, you have to show them. You have to find that man who built the warehouse. He's still in there. Don't let them turn you into a ghost before your time." The family watched, confused, as the frail old man struggled to move his hand. It took every ounce of strength he had. His muscles screamed and his lungs burned, but slowly his fingers closed around Maya's wrist. Arthur croaked. It was a small word, but it carried the weight of a mountain. Julian stepped closer. "Dad, don't be difficult. This is for the best. You're sick. I stay." "Here," Arthur said, his voice gaining a jagged edge of iron. He looked at the man in the gray suit. "Get ... out. All of you." "Dad, you're not thinking clearly," Claire started. "I said, out," Arthur roared. He pointed a trembling finger toward the door. "Maya stays. Or I'll spend every last cent ... on a foundation that ... ensures you never see a dime." The mention of the money did what love couldn't. Family backed away. Julian looked at Maya with pure hatred, but he saw the resolve in her eyes. He realized that this simple woman had done something they never could. She had given Arthur a reason to fight. When the room finally cleared, and the sound of their expensive cars faded down the driveway, the silence returned. But this time it wasn't the silence of a tomb. It was the silence of a victory. Maya sat back down, her own hands shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't talk about the money. She simply picked up the cloth, dipped it in the cool water, and began to wash his face. "That was a lot of energy, Arthur," she said with a small, tired smile. "I think you earned a nap." "I think the peppermint plant needs some sun." Arthur looked at her, his breathing finally leveling out. He realized that everyone in his life had been a yes-person people, who agreed with him because of his power, or people who handled him because of his weakness. Maya was the only one who had treated him like a partner. She had seen the billionaire, yes, but she had chosen to save the man. "Thank you," he whispered. Maya squeezed his hand. "Don't thank me yet. We still have a garden to plan." Arthur drifted off into a natural, peaceful sleep. He realized that for the first time in decades, he wasn't afraid of the future. The glass walls of his mansion didn't feel like a cage anymore. They felt like a greenhouse. And with Maya there, he knew that even if he only had a few months left, he was finally going to live them. The weeks following the confrontation were the quietest Arthur had known in years. But it was a busy kind of quiet. He wasn't sitting in front of the window like a statue anymore. Under Maya's watchful eye, he was relearning how to be a person. She pushed him, but never in a way that felt like a chore. She made him walk 3 extra steps to the dining table. She made him hold his own glass of water, even when his hand shook so much the ice rattled against the glass. But while they were finding peace inside the glass walls, a storm was gathering outside. Arthur's children hadn't gone away quietly. To them, Maya wasn't a savior. She was a threat to their inheritance. They couldn't understand why their father, a man who had always been cold and logical, would suddenly cling to a stranger from a low-cost agency. The attack came on a Tuesday afternoon. A man in a dark suit arrived at the front door, but it wasn't a doctor or a family member. It was a process server. Arthur was served with a petition for legal guardianship. His own children were taking him to court to have him declared mentally unfit. They wanted to prove that he was being manipulated, that his brain was too far gone to manage his own life or his own money. When Arthur read the papers, his face turned a ghostly shade of gray. He dropped the documents on the floor, the legal jargon feeling like a physical blow. "They want to take my voice," Arthur whispered, his voice trembling. "They want to tell a judge that I'm a child." Maya picked up the papers. She didn't look scared. She looked angry, but it was a controlled, protective anger. "They can only take your voice if you stay silent, Arthur. They are betting on you being the man you were 3 months ago, the man who had given up." The next few days were a blur of lawyers and tension. Arthur's house was no longer a sanctuary. It was a battlefield. A court-appointed evaluator was sent to the house to interview him. Maya was an opportunist who had used undue influence to alienate Arthur from his family. On the day of the evaluation, the house felt cold. The evaluator, a stern woman with a sharp bob and a notebook, sat across from Arthur in the library. Maya was told to stay in the other room. "Mr. Sterling," the evaluator began, "your children are concerned. They say you've stopped following medical advice. They say you've become hostile to your long-term staff. They believe you are no longer capable of making decisions for your own welfare." Arthur sat in his chair, his back straighter than it had been in years. He looked at the books on the shelves, books he had bought to look successful, but had never actually read. Then he looked at the little terracotta pot Maya had brought, which was now thriving on the mahogany desk. "My children are concerned about the welfare of my bank account," Arthur said, his voice steady. "For 20 years, I was a billionaire first and a father second. I taught them that money is the only thing that matters. I can't blame them for learning the lesson I taught them. But they are wrong about one thing." The evaluator looked up from her notes. "And what is that?" "They think I'm losing my mind because I've started caring about things that don't have a price tag," Arthur said. "I fired the staff because they didn't see me. I stayed in this house because I wanted to feel the sun on my skin, not a needle in my arm. If being unfit means wanting to spend my final days with the only person who treats me like a human being, then I suppose I am very unfit indeed." In the kitchen, Maya waited. She wasn't worried about her job. She was worried about Arthur's heart. She knew that the betrayal of one's own children was a wound that no medicine could heal. She started making a pot of tea, not the expensive herbal blends the previous nurses used, but the simple, strong black tea she had grown up with. When the evaluator left, she didn't say a word to Maya. She simply nodded and walked out the door. Arthur called Maya into the library. He looked exhausted, but there was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He took a long sip of the tea she brought him. "They think they can win because they have power," Arthur said. "But they forgot that I'm the one who invented the game they're playing. Not the one my son uses. My real attorney, the one I haven't spoken to since I retired." What are you going to do? Maya asked. I'm going to change my fate, Arthur replied. Everyone failed me because they thought I was a finished story. They thought they were just waiting for the final page to turn so they could close the book. But I've decided to add a new chapter. Over the next week, Arthur worked harder than he ever had at his tech company. He spent hours on the phone. He looked through old documents. He ignored his physical pain, fueled by a new sense of purpose. Maya stayed by his side, making sure he ate, making sure he rested, and most importantly, making sure he didn't lose his sense of humor. The final confrontation didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in the Sterling living room. Arthur invited Julian and Claire over for a final talk before the court date. They arrived looking smug, thinking they had one. They sat on the white leather sofas, looking at their watches. Dad, we're glad you're being reasonable, Julian said. The facility in Switzerland is really top-notch. You'll have everything you need. Arthur looked at them. He didn't see enemies. He saw the strangers he had raised. I've made a decision, he said. The court case won't be necessary because I've already shifted my assets. I've created a new trust. Claire leaned forward. A trust? For us? No, Arthur said. For the city. I'm turning this house into a respite center for caregivers and their patients, people who don't have billions of dollars. I'm funding a foundation that focuses on human-centric elder care. The kind of care that Maya gave me when no one else would. The color drained from Julian's face. You can't do that. That's hundreds of millions of dollars. It's my money, Arthur said firmly. And I've spent my life using it to build walls. Now, I'm using it to build a bridge. I've left you both enough to live comfortably for the rest of your lives, but the empire ends with me. I'm choosing a different legacy. This is her fault. Claire screamed, pointing at Maya. She's brainwashed you. Maya didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Arthur stood up from his chair. He didn't use the motor. He used his own legs, his hands gripping the armrests for support. He stood shaky, but tall. Maya didn't give me a new brain, Claire. She gave me back the one I had before I became a billionaire. She reminded me that at the end of the day, we are all just people waiting for someone to hold our hand in the dark. He looked at his children one last time. You can fight me in court if you want, but the world will see a father who wants to do good and children who just want his checkbook. Is that the headline you want for your careers? Julian and Claire looked at each other. They knew they were beaten. They hadn't expected the old man to have any fight left in him. They had failed him because they had underestimated the power of being loved for who you are, rather than what you own. As they walked out of the house, defeated, Arthur sank back into his chair. He was breathless and tired, but he felt lighter than he had in decades. He looked at Maya, who was already standing by the window, checking on the peppermint plant. Well, Arthur said, a faint smile on his lips. I think that went rather well. Maya walked over and sat on the footstool near his feet. You were very brave, Arthur. I wasn't brave, he said, reaching out to pat her hand. I was just finally awake. Now, tell me more about this garden you want to build. I think we have some work to do. The final year of Arthur Sterling's life didn't look anything like the 79 years that had come before it. The glass mansion on the cliff was gone. Single-story farmhouse nestled in a valley where the air smelled of eucalyptus and damp earth. It wasn't a mogul's house. It was a home. There were no high-tech security gates or clinical white floors. Instead, there were wooden porches, wide hallways for his wheelchair, and, most importantly, a massive garden that stretched out toward the hills. Maya was still there. She wasn't just his caregiver anymore. Together, they had started the Sterling Maya Initiative. It was a simple program, but it changed everything for the local community. They provided funding and training for home care workers, focusing on people who had the heart for the job but lacked the resources. They taught people that the most important tool in a medical kit wasn't a thermometer, but the ability to listen. Arthur spent his mornings on the porch. He didn't check stock prices or look at the tech news. Instead, he worked on a small wooden table Maya had set up for him. His hands still shook, but he had learned to embrace the tremor. He spent his time sketching designs for public parks, places where old people and children could sit together. "You're a better architect than you were a CEO," Maya teased him one afternoon as she brought out 2 glasses of lemonade. Arthur chuckled, a deep, healthy sound that came from his chest. "I'm a better human, Maya. That's the only promotion that actually matters." One afternoon, a car pulled into the driveway. It wasn't a sleek black limousine like the ones his children used to drive. It was a modest SUV. Julian stepped out. He looked older, less polished, and a bit more tired. He had spent the last year realizing that, without his father's shadow to stand in, he had to figure out who he actually was. He walked up to the porch and sat in the chair next to Arthur. They didn't talk for a long time. They just watched the wind move through the lavender plants. "I didn't understand," Julian said finally, his voice quiet. "I thought you were losing it. I thought you were being tricked. But I came by the center in the city yesterday. I saw the families there. I saw how they looked at the people taking care of them. They weren't afraid. They were ... peaceful." Arthur turned his head slowly. "Peace is expensive, Julian. Not in terms of money, but in terms of ego. It costs you your pride to admit that you need someone else. It costs you your power to let someone truly see you." Julian looked at his father, really looked at him for the first time in a decade. He didn't see a billionaire. He saw a man who was happy. "I'm sorry, Dad. For everything." Arthur reached out and placed his hand over his son's. It was the first time they had touched without a camera or a lawyer present in years. "The past is a debt that's already been paid, Julian. Let's just sit here for a while." As the months passed, Arthur's strength began to wane. It wasn't a sudden crash or a violent illness. It was a slow, natural fading, like a candle finally reaching the end of its wick. But unlike the year before, he wasn't afraid. He wasn't surrounded by monitors and strangers in white coats. On his final evening, the sun was setting in a deep, fiery orange. Maya had moved his bed near the large window that looked out over the garden they had built together. The smell of jasmine was thick in the air. "Do you remember the peppermint plant?" Arthur asked, his voice a soft whisper. Maya smiled, sitting by his side and holding his hand. "I still have it. It's a giant bush now, taking over the corner of the patio." "You saved my life with that plant," Arthur said. "Everyone else gave me machines. You gave me something that needed me to stay alive, so I could watch it grow. You gave me a reason to be useful. You saved yourself, Arthur," Maya said softly. "I just held the door open." Arthur closed his eyes. He thought about his life. He had built empires of silicon and gold, but none of it felt as real as the warmth of Maya's hand or the scent of the garden. He realized that his fate had been to die a lonely man in a glass tower, forgotten by the world and resented by his blood. But because one person had refused to treat him like a billionaire, he was dying as a man who was loved. He passed away in his sleep that night. There was no drama, no shouting, and no panic. Just a quiet transition from one state of being to the next. The funeral wasn't a corporate event. There were no press releases or industry titans giving speeches. Instead, the garden was filled with the people whose lives he had touched in his final year: caregivers, neighbors, and the families from the center. Julian and Claire were there too, looking not like heirs but like grieving children. Maya stayed until the very end. When everyone had left, she walked to the corner of the garden and planted a small, new sapling and oak tree. She didn't cry for him because she knew he had finished his story exactly the way he wanted to. He had rewritten the ending. He had proven that it's never too late to be human, and it's never too late to let someone in. As she walked back toward the house, she saw a young woman standing at the gate. She was wearing simple clothes and looking at the house with a mix of awe and nervousness. She was the newest trainee for the nursing program. A girl from the city who wanted to learn how to care for people. Maya smiled and walked toward her. "Hello," Maya said, echoing the words she had said to Arthur all those months ago. "Come in. We have a lot to talk about." Sterling's billions were gone, distributed to a world that needed them. But his true legacy, The idea that every person deserves to be seen was just beginning to grow. The billionaire who everyone had failed had finally succeeded in the only way that mattered. He had learned how to love. And he had learned how to be loved in return. The first spring without Arthur was the hardest for Maya, even though the farmhouse was filled with the life of the new training center. There were moments when the silence in his old study felt like a physical weight. She found herself walking to the porch at sunset, expecting to see him there with his shaky hands and his sharp, newfound wit. But the chair was empty, and the only sound was the wind moving through the oak tree she had planted in his honor. Maya spent her mornings teaching the new recruits. She didn't teach them how to read heart monitors. There were plenty of schools for that. She taught them how to watch a patient's eyes. She taught them how to tell the difference between a sigh of pain and a sigh of loneliness. She was busy, but she felt a lingering sense of unfinished business. One rainy Tuesday, a courier arrived at the farmhouse. He carried a small, weathered wooden box that looked like it had been sitting in a bank vault for decades. There was a note on top in Arthur's unmistakable, jagged handwriting. To Maya and Julian. To be opened when the first roses bloom, Maya called Julian. He had been staying in the city, working on a project to turn one of his father's old factories into low-income housing. He arrived within the hour, his boots muddy and his face tired. But his eyes were clearer than they had ever been during his years as a corporate executive. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where they had once argued over legal papers. Now they shared a pot of the strong black tea Arthur had grown to love. He always had to have the last word, didn't he? Julian said with a sad, small smile. Maya nodded. He was a man who planned 10 steps ahead. Even when he was dying, he was thinking about what we would need after he was gone. They opened the box together. Inside, there weren't more stocks or keys to hidden properties. Instead, there were dozens of handwritten letters, each one addressed to a different person. There were letters for the janitors at his old company, letters for the nurses he had once been difficult with, and letters for the neighbors he had ignored for 40 years. But at the bottom of the box was a thick envelope addressed to both of them. Inside was a map of a small, forgotten plot of land in the center of the city, the very spot where Arthur's mother had grown those tomatoes he had talked about in his final days. The letter read, I spent my life buying up the world, but I never owned the one place that made me who I was. I bought this land back in secret 6 months ago. It isn't for a skyscraper. It isn't for a tech hub. It's for you two to build a garden. Not a private one behind glass walls, but a place where people who have nothing can grow something of their own. Maya, give them the heart. Julian, give them the structure. Don't fail the people the way the world failed me. Julian looked at the map, and for the first time, he didn't see a development opportunity. Saw a chance to finally connect with the father he had only truly met at the end. He wants us to work together, Julian whispered. He knew we'd both be lost without him. He knew that a legacy isn't something you leave to people, Maya said, her voice thick with emotion. It's something you leave in them. Over the next year, the community garden project became a local phenomenon. Maya and Julian were there every weekend. They weren't bosses. They were workers. Maya showed the local kids how to plant seeds so they wouldn't drown in the rain. And Julian used his logistical mind to set up irrigation. Systems that didn't cost a fortune. The project changed the neighborhood. People who had lived in the same apartment buildings for years without ever speaking to one another were suddenly sharing tools and trading vegetables. The invisible people, the elderly, the struggling, the lonely found a place where they were seen. One evening, as the garden project was celebrating its first harvest, Maya stood back and watched the crowd. She saw Julian laughing with an old man who lived down the street. She saw the young nurses from her training center helping a disabled woman plant a rose bush. She felt a hand on her shoulder. It was one of her students, a young girl who had started out just as nervous as Maya had been on her first day at the Sterling estate. Do you think he'd be happy? The girl asked, looking at the vibrant, messy, beautiful life filling the garden. Maya thought about Arthur, the man in the glass tomb, the man on the balcony, and finally, the man who died with dirt under his fingernails and peace in his heart. He wouldn't just be happy, Maya said, a tear finally escaping and rolling down her cheek. He'd say, "We're finally being useful." The story of the billionaire and the caregiver didn't end with a funeral. It lived on in every hand that reached out to help another. It lived on in the idea that wealth isn't what you have in the bank, but how many people feel less alone because you are in the world. Everyone had failed the billionaire because they saw his money and not his soul. But in the end, because one woman chose to look closer, he didn't just change his own fate, he changed the fate of an entire community. Maya walked over to a small bench dedicated to Arthur. She sat down, took a deep breath of the scent of tomato plants and fresh earth, and smiled. The glass walls were gone forever. There was only the open sky, the growing green, and the quiet, steady beating of a legacy that would never truly die.